Please save my father. Tonight he will be killed." The biker bar fell into a heavy silence. A 5-year-old girl, soaked from the storm, stood trembling on a wooden crutch with her loyal K9 at her side. In her tiny hand were 8 crumpled dollars, the only thing she could offer in exchange for hope. Rough men known for roaring engines and steel stares froze in their seats, realizing that a desperate child had just walked into their world and begged them to do what no one else would. From that moment, a chain of events began that would change everything. This is not just a story about violence or fear, but about courage, loyalty, and the silent heroes who rise when no one else dares to. Stay with us until the end, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and how this story makes you feel. Do not forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and I wish you a good day filled with kindness and strength. The night was drenched in relentless rain, the streets of the small American town almost deserted as the storm battered down. In the distance, neon signs flickered against the darkness, and the air carried the smell of wet asphalt and gasoline. Inside the biker bar known as the Iron Serpents, the laughter of rough men and the clinking of bottles filled the smoky room. These men were the kind who wore their past on their skin tattoos, scars, and leather jackets patched with insignias that marked both pride and survival. It was a place outsiders rarely dared to enter, yet on that storm-soaked night, the door creaked open, and something utterly unexpected shattered the rhythm of their world. Through the threshold stepped a 5-year-old girl named Emily, her small frame trembling as she leaned heavily on a wooden crutch, her metal prosthetic leg catching the dim yellow light. Rain dripped from her blonde hair and her scarf clung to her neck, while beside her padded Rex, a large German shepherd with sharp, watchful eyes. She limped forward, the sound of her crutch tapping across the wooden floor, and with her free hand she laid 8 crumpled dollar bills on the counter. Her voice cracked but carried across the silent room. "Please save my father, Jack Carter. Tonight he will be killed." The words hung in the air, heavier than the storm outside. Every biker froze, the clinking of bottles ceased, and the jukebox in the corner seemed to fall mute. At the far end of the bar, Cole, the leader of the Iron Serpents, slowly raised his eyes to the child. He was a man in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, his beard peppered with silver, his dark hair falling untamed to his collar. A black leather jacket hugged his frame, the emblem of the serpent spread across the back like a warning. His eyes, sharp and calculating, were not accustomed to softening, yet in that moment they narrowed not in suspicion, but in something deeper recognition of desperation too raw to ignore. Emily's voice cracked as she tried to explain. Jack, her father, was not just a man, but a veteran, a soldier who had once stood tall in the service of his country. In the quiet years since, he had tried to live simply, raising his daughter with dignity even when life offered little more than hardship. But one night, everything changed. A gang of local criminals men steeped in the trade of meth and violence, their names whispered with fear in every corner of town, had cornered Emily in a back alley. They were predators, feeding on weakness. Jack had stepped in, his fists in fury ignited by a father's instinct. Before the eyes of onlookers, he had struck down their leader, leaving him bleeding on the dirt road. The pride of those thugs was wounded, and from that day forward, they swore revenge. Now Emily told them that night had come. The gang had chosen Maple Road, an abandoned stretch of warehouses and shadows, as the place where they would end Jack Carter's life. Her small chest heaved as she spoke, tears streaking through grime on her cheeks. Rex leaned closer, ears twitching, his low growl punctuating her words as if to confirm every one of them. The bikers in the bar shifted in their seats, heavy boots scraping against wood, their tattoos and scars suddenly alive with unspoken anger. They knew that name, that gangmen who had terrorized shopkeepers, beaten innocents, and poisoned their streets. The thought of a child walking 2 miles through a storm to ask them for help stirred something deep, something that made even the hardest men clench their jaws. Cole's voice finally cut through the silence, low and gravelly, but carrying a weight that could not be mistaken. "A little girl walked through the storm with $8 to beg us to save her father," he said, eyes scanning the room. "If we turn our backs now, we're no men at all." His words struck like thunder. Around him, the iron serpents shifted from disbelief to resolve. This was no longer just a child's plea. It was a call to arms that touched the fragments of humanity buried beneath layers of violence and scars. The bikers rose almost as one, jackets zipped, chains rattled, and helmets pulled tight. Outside, the storm still howled, but its roar was soon drowned by another Harley engines igniting one after another, the thunder of machines shaking the ground. The bar's windows rattled as if the storm itself bowed to the sound. Emily was lifted gently into a sidecar, Rex jumping in beside her, the dog's body pressed protectively against her small frame. She clutched the damp bills to her chest, eyes wide with a mix of fear and fragile hope. The glow of the bar lights faded as Cole swung his leg over his bike, the emblem of the serpents catching the flash of lightning. The convoy tore into the night, wheels slicing through puddles, headlights carving paths through the sheets of rain. Inside the sidecar, Emily clung to Rex, her little hand buried in the thick fur of his neck, feeling his steady breath and strength. The dog's eyes stayed forward, ears perked, as though he understood the mission at hand. Cole led at the front, his silhouette dark and commanding against the streaks of lightning, while behind him, row after row of riders followed in formation. For years, the town had whispered of the iron serpents as outlaws, men who thrived in chaos, their loyalty only to each other. But that night, as the storm swallowed them whole, they became something else, an iron wall between a child and the monsters who hunted her family. The echo of their engines was more than noise. It was a vow, a declaration that some lines would never be crossed while they still drew breath. And so the night of $8 in the storm began, carrying them all toward Maple Road, toward danger, and toward a reckoning that none of them could yet imagine. The convoy of Harleys thundered into the storm, the roar of engines cutting through the rain-soaked silence of the sleeping town. The storm whipped sideways, sheets of water pelting down on leather jackets and steel helmets, but the riders did not falter. Their headlights pierced the black curtain of night, glowing like the eyes of predators moving as one. Inside the sidecar, Emily clung tightly to Rex, her small fingers buried in the thick fur of his neck, while the dog leaned forward, ears pricked, his breath steady, his body tense as though every drop of rain only sharpened his senses. The child's crutch lay across her lap, rattling with every bump of the wet road, and though fear pressed heavy against her chest, the sound of the engines around her was a strange comfort, like an army that had sworn itself to her fragile cause. Cole led at the front, his broad back hunched low against the wind, rain streaming down his jacket, the serpent emblem glistening under flashes of lightning. He didn't glance back often, but every few seconds he checked his mirrors, ensuring the sidecar that carried Emily and Rex stayed safely tucked within the protective circle of headlights. Behind him, rows of bikers hunched into the storm, their eyes narrowed against the driving rain, boots gripping hard against pedals, the unified sound of their machines a defiance against the night. To anyone watching, they would have looked less like outlaws and more like dark horsemen summoned out of thunder, riding not for chaos but for something strangely noble. Inside the sidecar, Emily's teeth chattered, though whether from cold or terror she could not tell. She pressed her forehead against Rex's wet fur, whispering to him, though her words were swallowed by the storm. The German shepherd lifted his head suddenly, nostrils flaring, and gave a sharp bark that cut through the roar of engines. His nose pressed against the air, catching a trace that no human could sense. Emily raised her head, her eyes widening. She knew that smell too. It was the worn jacket her father had left behind when he tried to hide from his hunters. Rex barked again, his body twisting as though to point toward the far left road that curved deeper into the industrial quarter. The bikers took notice, their leader glancing once at the girl, and when she nodded with desperate certainty, the convoy veered in unison toward the direction Rex demanded. The road narrowed into a long strip of cracked asphalt lined with skeletal warehouses, their broken windows glaring like hollow eyes, graffiti smeared across rusted doors, the kind of place where the city's forgotten stories gathered in shadows. Maple Road had once been the beating heart of the town's industry, but now it was nothing more than a graveyard of concrete and steel, where gangs whispered and police hesitated. Emily's breath hitched as she recognized the place she had begged the bikers to reach. Her father was somewhere in that darkness, alone and bleeding, and every second felt like a countdown she could not stop. She pressed closer to Rex, who kept barking as if to tell her they were getting closer, his growl carrying both urgency and fury. Cole's eyes scanned the road ahead, his jaw clenched beneath the shadow of his helmet. Memories pressed against his mind unbidden, and for a moment the storm outside bled into the storm inside his chest. He saw himself as a boy 10 years old, crouched behind a broken fence in a forgotten corner of another town, rain dripping through holes in his torn shirt. He remembered a night not so different from this one, when he had run barefoot through alleys begging for help while his drunk father raised a hand against his mother. No one had come. No one had cared. The world had looked away, and that wound had never fully healed. Now, looking at the fragile figure of Emily, he felt the sting of that old wound ignite into something sharper. He whispered under his breath, though the storm almost drowned it out. "Tonight, no child will be left behind." Behind him, the bikers rode grim-faced, their resolve hardening with every mile. Some were men scarred by prison years, others broken by wars, others cast aside by families who never wanted them. They were not saints, and many carried sins heavier than they could count, but in the way they tightened their formation around the sidecar, in the way they tilted their heads toward Emily each time Rex barked, it was clear they had chosen their side tonight. They rode not as wolves circling prey, but as guardians shielding one fragile light against the dark. The storm seemed determined to slow them, water rising in streams across the road, the wind lashing like a whip, but the convoy pushed forward. Tires spat water into arcs of silver, the engines roared against the thunder, and sparks glimmered briefly where metal scraped against broken asphalt. To Emily, it was terrifying and beautiful all at once. She looked out from the sidecar, her eyes widening as the riders leaned into the storm, their bodies a wall of defiance. For the first time that night, she felt something beyond fear. She felt the trembling birth of hope. They reached the edge of Maple Road at last, the convoy slowing as the shadows of abandoned warehouses loomed closer. Broken glass crunched beneath their tires, and the sound of water dripping from rusted beams echoed like whispers in the dark. Rex barked louder, pulling at the edge of the sidecar, his body straining toward one warehouse more than the others. His instincts were clear. Jack had been here, his scent clinging to the cold air. Emily pressed her hands against the sidecar's edge, her breath shallow, her eyes locked on the building Rex had chosen. Cole raised one hand, signaling the convoy to halt, their headlights casting long, fractured beams across cracked walls, and puddles shimmering like pools of mercury. For a moment the storm seemed to hush, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The bikers sat in silence, their engines idling low, the smell of gasoline mixing with the scent of wet rust and earth. Emily clutched Rex, her small chest heaving, while Cole lowered his hand slowly, eyes narrowing at the warehouse ahead. He remembered his whispered vow and felt its weight press against him like armor. In that silence, with the storm raging just beyond the circle of their lights, the leader of the Iron Serpents muttered once more, his voice low and resolute, "Tonight, no child will be left behind." And with that vow still hanging in the night air, the bikers braced themselves for what awaited inside Maple Road, their engines humming like a heart about to burst, their shadows stretching long and dark across the storm-soaked ground. The convoy slowed as the broken outlines of the warehouses grew sharper in the storm's dim light, their headlights painting fractured beams across walls mottled with rust and graffiti. Rain hammered against metal roofs, each drop echoing like a drumbeat of war, while the ground turned slick beneath the spinning tires. The bikers knew they were close, for Rex had not stopped barking since they turned onto Maple Road, his body straining against the sidecar, as though every fiber in him recognized the scent of his master. Emily's face pressed against the edge, her small fingers gripping the cold steel, and in the glow of the headlights her wide eyes caught sight of a shadow moving just beyond the warehouse doors. The convoy tightened its formation, their engines rumbling low, and the night itself seemed to shiver in anticipation of the clash about to unfold. The doors of the warehouse creaked open, and there, bathed in rain and light, stood Jack Carter. He was on his knees, his body hunched forward, his shirt torn and soaked crimson with blood. His hands trembled as he clutched at the ground, trying to push himself upright against the onslaught of fists and boots that had beaten him down. His face was pale beneath the streaks of rain and blood, silver strands of hair matted against his brow, yet his eyes still burned with the defiance of a man who refused to yield. Every breath was ragged, each movement laced with agony, but even broken, he tried to rise. Towering over him was the man who had sworn revenge, a brute in his late 30s, his body thick with muscle and his shaved head glistening in the stormlight. His leather jacket was ripped at the shoulder, revealing tattoos that snaked across his arm like chains, and in his fist he clutched a steel pipe, its surface dented from countless fights. His face twisted with rage, teeth bared in a grimace, his voice a growl as he spat curses down at the man who had once humiliated him. Around him, a few other thugs lingered in the shadows, their movements hesitant, their eyes darting nervously toward the thunder of Harleys that was closing in. Yet the leader did not hesitate. He raised the pipe high above his head, ready to bring it crashing down onto Jack's skull and end it once and for all. The bikers surged forward, engines revving into a deafening roar, headlights aligning in a perfect line that cut through the darkness like a wall of fire. The sudden blaze of light struck the gang leader's eyes, forcing him to squint and hesitate, the steel pipe still suspended in his hand. In that split second of hesitation, Rex leapt from the sidecar, his paws splashing against the wet pavement, his body low and powerful, his bark exploding like gunfire through the night. The sound was primal, a warning that needed no translation, and the thugs stumbled back instinctively, their confidence crumbling beneath the weight of that feral sound. Emily cried out his name, her voice breaking, but Rex did not falter. His loyalty was stronger than any fear. The gang leader cursed and swung the pipe in Rex's direction, but before he could land a blow, two of the bikers flanked him. One was a tall man with a shaved head and a scar running down his jaw, his leather jacket patched at the elbows, his hands steady as steel. The other, stockier, with a thick beard and eyes cold as ice. They moved in unison, their boots splashing through puddles as they lunged, knocking the pipe from his hand with a swift strike. The weapon clattered to the ground, sliding into the shadows, and the leader was forced down, his arms wrenched behind him before he could even resist. No fists were thrown beyond what was necessary. These men knew restraint, and their purpose tonight was not vengeance, but protection. Jack staggered, his knees giving way as he collapsed back into the mud, his breath leaving him in a broken gasp. Another biker rushed forward, crouching at his side, pulling open a saddlebag to reveal a first aid kit. His hands moved with practiced urgency, pressing gauze against the bleeding wound along Jack's ribs, whispering calm words that were drowned by the rain but carried the weight of solidarity. Emily scrambled out of the sidecar, her crutch clattering against the wet ground as she hobbled forward, her prosthetic leg dragging slightly with every hurried step. She fell beside her father, clutching his arm, her tears mixing with rain as she whispered his name over and over again. Jack's bloodied hand reached for hers, squeezing weakly, and though no words came, the look in his eyes was enough. He was still alive, still fighting, and he had heard her call. The gang members who lingered in the shadows stepped back further, cowed by the sight of 15 Harleys blazing their light upon them. They knew they were outnumbered, outmatched, and more than that, their resolve had cracked in the presence of something they could not understand. The Iron Serpents were men they had mocked and feared, but tonight they stood united not for chaos, but for a child and her broken father. The thugs fled into the darkness, slipping away into the alleys, leaving their leader pinned under the weight of two bikers who refused to let him rise. Cole stepped forward at last, his boots steady against the slick ground, his eyes burning as they settled on the fallen Jack Carter. He gave a curt nod to the man applying pressure to the wounds, then turned his gaze to Emily, who knelt beside her father with Rex pressed close to her side. For a moment, the leader of the Serpents said nothing, his jaw set and his face carved from stone, but in his silence lay a decision that spoke louder than words. He would not let them fall, not tonight, not while the storm raged, not while a little girl had chosen to trust them with her last hope. The night hung heavy with tension, every drop of rain amplifying the silence that followed the chaos. The gang leader cursed from where he was held, his voice cracking with desperation, but his words were drowned beneath the unyielding presence of engines idling low and steady, like the heartbeat of giants. Jack's breathing steadied under the careful hands of the biker who worked to stop the bleeding, the crimson seeping slower now, though his strength was nearly gone. Emily pressed closer, whispering promises to her father, and Rex lay across his legs, refusing to move, his body a shield against the world. The confrontation was over as quickly as it had begun, but the weight of it lingered like thunder that refused to fade. In the glow of headlights reflecting off rain-slick asphalt, the truth was undeniable. Jack had been the hunted, beaten down, and left for dead, and the gang who swore revenge had been the predators. Yet in that warehouse yard, under the storm's unrelenting fury, it was clear to all who stood there who the true villains were, and who had come as guardians in the night. The night air still trembled with the echoes of engines and the storm's relentless fury, when a new sound cut through the sharp wail of sirens. Red and blue lights sliced across the rain, scattering against the wet concrete walls of the warehouse yard, casting the battered scene into a kaleidoscope of flashing shadows. The bikers remained where they stood, their headlights casting long beams across the broken figure of Jack Carter, whose body was slumped against the ground, his breaths shallow, blood mixing with the rain. Beside him, Emily clung desperately to his arm, her little crutch discarded on the ground, while Rex stood guard over them both, his growl low and warning, his fur bristling beneath the stormlight. Police cruisers skidded to a halt, doors flinging open as officers poured out with weapons drawn, their shouts sharp and commanding over the roar of the rain. They saw Jack collapsed on the ground, the steel pipe lying just inches from his bleeding hand, and without hesitation moved to restrain him. Two younger officers, faces tense with adrenaline, rushed forward, pinning him against the wet pavement even as his body barely resisted. "Hands behind your back," one barked, pressing the muzzle of his gun toward the man's shoulder. The irony was cruel. Jack was too broken to even rise, yet in their eyes he was the aggressor. Emily's cry pierced through the chaos, raw and desperate. She threw herself over her father's chest, sobbing as she wrapped her tiny arms around him. "My dad only defended himself. He didn't do anything wrong," she wailed, her voice echoing against the concrete walls, trembling but unyielding. The officers hesitated for a heartbeat, their eyes flicking between the child's face and the bikers looming nearby, their engines still rumbling like thunder. But procedure pulled them forward, and one officer tried to pry Emily away. Rex lunged with a snarl, stopping just short, his fangs bared, his amber eyes blazing. It was not an attack, but a warning as clear as any words. No one would take this child from her father without proving why. Cole raised his hand, a silent command that rippled through the ranks of bikers. They closed in, not with fists or weapons, but with their sheer presence, forming a human barricade around Emily and Rex. The rain slicked across their leather jackets, their faces grim and unflinching, their boots planted firmly in the mud. The officers stiffened, hands twitching near holsters, tension thick enough to suffocate. But Cole's voice broke through, low and measured. "Check your evidence before you make a mistake," he said, his tone neither threat nor plea, but something in between, a demand for fairness that carried the weight of authority born not of badges, but of lived violence and survival. From the side of the group, a biker with a lined face and calm eyes stepped forward, holding up a phone already recording. His name was Briggs, a man in his 50s, his leather vest worn and his hair cropped short, the scars on his hands proof of hard decades. He raised the phone high, the glow of the screen clear even in the rain. The video played back, showing in stark clarity the moment the gang leader had swung first, the steel pipe flashing under the dim light as Jack staggered to block the blow. The officers froze, their eyes narrowing as they leaned closer to watch, the audio catching the curses and threats hurled before the bikers had even arrived. The narrative shifted in an instant. Jack was not the aggressor but the victim who had barely survived the ambush. At that moment, a man from the row of houses across the street appeared, an older neighbor wrapped in a raincoat, his umbrella nearly torn from his grip by the wind. His lined face was pale but resolute as he called out above the storm. "I saw it! That gang went after him first. The poor man was only trying to keep them off his girl." His words were backed by more than memory. He held out a flash drive pulled from a home security system, its recordings already queued. One officer accepted it, plugging it into the dash of a cruiser, the screen showing grainy footage from a porch camera. The video confirmed what the phone had shown: Jack beaten down, Emily crying, the thugs circling with steel in their hands. The officers began to exchange glances, the sharp edges of their authority softening into something less certain. They turned back to Jack, still lying weak in the rain, his wrists bleeding where rough hands had tried to bind him. One officer crouched down, pulling a flashlight from his belt and sweeping it over Jack's body. The light revealed more than fresh wounds. It showed bruises along his forearms, the telltale marks of defensive injuries, places where a man had raised his arms to block strikes meant to crush bone. The beam shifted to Emily, her small dress damp and clinging, revealing faint bruises along her arm and shoulder. The child flinched as the light touched her, but did not hide them. Those marks told a history no words could deny, scars of abuse from nights when no one had come. Silence spread across the yard, broken only by the rain. The officers no longer pressed their weight onto Jack. Instead, they stood back, the evidence now pressing on them harder than duty. One officer, his face weary beneath his cap, gave a small nod to his partner. The handcuffs were withdrawn, the pressure lifted. "Get him an ambulance," he muttered, his voice subdued, no longer sharp with command but edged with something heavier regret. The paramedics, who had just arrived and were waiting for clearance, rushed forward with a stretcher, their blue uniforms glistening in the storm as they moved quickly to lift Jack from the mud. The gang leader, still pinned beneath two bikers, spat curses and tried to thrash, but this time the police turned their focus on him. Rough hands yanked him upright. Cold steel clicked around his wrists and his face twisted with rage as he was marched toward the back of a cruiser. His boots splashed against puddles, his eyes burning with venom. But there was no triumph left in his fight. Emily watched through tears, clutching Rex tightly, her small body trembling against the warmth of his fur. She did not understand all the words being spoken, but she understood the sight of her father being lifted carefully onto a stretcher while the man who had tried to kill him was led away in cuffs. Cole exhaled slowly, the tension in his broad shoulders finally easing, though his eyes remained hard. He looked at Emily, who glanced up at him with wet cheeks, her lips trembling with words she could not find. He gave her a single nod, a silent promise that the night's vow was still unbroken. Around him, the iron serpents stood steady, their engines still rumbling, their presence undeniable. The storm had not passed, but the truth had been carved into the night, undeniable and clear. Jack was lifted into the ambulance, his pale face turned toward his daughter as Emily was allowed to walk beside the stretcher, her crutch tucked under her arm once more. Rex padded faithfully at her side, his amber eyes glowing in the emergency lights, his body brushing against her leg with every step as if to lend her strength. The doors closed with a heavy thud, and the ambulance pulled away, siren wailing as it carried Jack toward safety. Behind, the bikers stood silent, rain coursing down their faces, engines steady as a vow. The false accusation had been broken, the truth secured. The storm had passed, though the echoes of its chaos still lingered in the air. The night on Maple Road had ended with flashing lights, raised voices, and truths carved into evidence too strong to deny. By the time dawn arrived, the worst had been laid to rest. Jack Carter was in the hospital, his name cleared of accusation, and the man who had sought his life was behind bars, his reign of fear reduced to the clink of handcuffs. The warehouse yard stood silent, save for the dripping of rain from rusted beams, and the bikers, tired and soaked to the bone, rode back into town carrying with them not only a wounded man, but the memory of a vow fulfilled. At the Iron Serpent's bar, the neon lights hummed against the first pale rays of sunrise. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of leather, gasoline, and wet clothing, but also with something rarer quiet pride. The riders sat scattered across the room, their jackets still damp, their hands wrapped around mugs of steaming coffee poured from a battered pot. On one corner of the bar counter lay 8 crumpled dollar bills, still damp from Emily's trembling hands the night before. They had survived the storm, just as she had, but their weight now seemed different, almost sacred. Cole stood before them, silent, his broad frame casting a shadow over the counter, his weathered face unreadable. With deliberate care, Cole picked up the bills, smoothing them gently as though afraid they might tear. His eyes flicked toward the girl, who now sat curled in a booth beside Rex, her small crutch leaning against the wall, her head resting against the dog's flank. Emily's eyelids fluttered with exhaustion, but her hand clung tightly to her father's dog tag, the chain looped loosely around her fingers, a symbol of the man who fought to stay alive for her. Rex watched everything with quiet vigilance, his golden brown chest rising and falling steadily, his ears twitching each time the door creaked or a chair shifted. Loyalty radiated from the dog like heat, unyielding and fierce. Cole's voice broke the silence, gravelly yet steady. "These $8 bought more than a promise," he said, holding the damp bills for all to see. "They bought us a reminder that sometimes the strongest call for help comes from the smallest voice." His eyes scanned the room, meeting those of his brothers, men hardened by years of violence, yet softened by the memory of the little girl who had walked into their bar and asked them to be more than what the world believed they were. No one spoke, but heads nodded, jaws clenched, and in that silence lay a bond unspoken. A week later, the bills no longer lay loose on the counter. They had been framed in wood and glass, mounted on the wall above the bar where every man who walked through the door could see them. The frame was plain, but the meaning was anything but. Beneath the glass, the $8 seemed to glow in the neon light, a relic of a night when demons had chosen to act as angels. Above the frame, Cole had carved a simple inscription: "For the child who walked into the storm and gave us reason to stand in the light." The bikers raised their glasses that night, not to victory, not to violence, but to a vow that would outlast them all. Emily returned to her father's side once he had been released from the hospital, her small steps steady on the crutch, her smile growing brighter with each passing day. The bruises that had once stained her arms faded slowly, replaced by the spark in her eyes, a light unbroken by fear. She grew up surrounded not only by her father's love, but by the quiet circle of guardians who had chosen her as one of their own. Rex never left her side, padding at her heels, watching the world with the same unwavering vigilance that had carried him through the storm. For Emily, every day was marked by resilience. For Jack, every sunrise was a reminder that hope could be rebuilt from ruin. Jack himself changed in ways subtle but profound. The bitterness that had weighed on his shoulders for years seemed to lift, replaced by the quiet dignity of a man who had been given another chance to believe. His scars remained, but they no longer told the story of defeat. They told the story of survival, of a father saved not only by his own courage, but by the unexpected mercy of men the world had condemned. He walked slower now, his body marked by pain, but his eyes carried a steadiness that inspired those who met them. He began to speak again of service, not as a soldier, but as a man who still had something left to give. The iron serpents carried the memory with them, too. Each Thursday night, when the bar filled with laughter, smoke, and the rumble of stories old and new, someone's gaze would drift toward the frame on the wall. Silence would fall for a beat, and in that silence, each man remembered why they had ridden into the storm, why they had chosen to shield rather than strike. Outsiders still saw them as outlaws, their jackets and scars symbols of fear, but within those walls they remembered themselves as something more. And whenever Emily visited, her smile lit the room brighter than neon, her presence proof that even the roughest hands could build something tender. Years passed, and the story of that night became more than a memory. It became legend whispered in the town, retold in fragments that always seemed to grow with each telling. Some spoke of the roar of 15 Harleys drowning out the storm, others of the little girl who bought salvation with $8, and still others of the dog whose bark turned back death itself. The truth was simpler, yet greater, that in the darkest hour men feared as monsters had chosen to be protectors. And that truth lingered, not only in the frame above the bar, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. Emily grew tall, her steps sure even with the crutch, her laughter ringing like bells against the walls of the bar whenever she visited. Her eyes held a light that had never been extinguished, and each time she looked at the frame on the wall, she would smile, knowing those bills represented not just money, but faith. The faith she had placed in strangers who became family. Jack watched her with quiet pride, his heart steadied by the bond between his daughter, Rex, and the Brotherhood that had refused to abandon them. And through it all, Rex aged beside them, his muzzle turning gray, his steps slower, but his loyalty unbroken, his eyes always fixed on the ones he had chosen to protect. The tale closed not with a grand gesture, but with a truth that endured beyond storms and battles. Heroes did not always wear uniforms or capes, nor did they always arrive with sirens or medals. Sometimes they came clad in leather, their engines roaring like thunder, their reputations shadowed by fear, yet their choices illuminated by light. Sometimes the most dangerous men became the gentlest protectors, not because the world believed in them, but because one small voice asked them to. And so the $8 remained, a promise in glass and wood, reminding all who entered the Iron Serpent's bar that when darkness fell, it was still possible to stand on the side of light. In the end, what we remember is not the storm or the violence, but the loyalty of a dog who never left, and the kindness of people who chose sacrifice over silence. Rex reminds us that love does not need words, and the bikers remind us that true strength is found in compassion, even when the world sees you as something else. Sometimes the greatest heroes are not loud, but those who protect quietly, who stand in the rain so others can walk in the light. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to join us for more stories of faith, loyalty, and humanity. May God bless you and keep you safe wherever you are.